Hello, I'm the 10-minute English teacher. Let's get you exam ready. Today we're thinking about A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, and I'm going to be providing you with a summary, quotes to know and analysis for Stave 1. Before we move on, don't forget to like and subscribe. There are plenty of videos to help you revise for A Christmas Carol and other texts you're studying for English literature. Okay, Stave 1. In front of you now are some key images. Each one of those relates to a significant moment that takes place in Stave 1. By the end of our time together, you should be able to recall exactly what happens in the act. So it starts with Dickens describing Scrooge before we actually meet him. So we find out exactly what he's like, and it's not pleasant. Scrooge is as solitary as an oyster, which does at least promise there could be something good inside him. Lots of associations with sin, darkness and misery are made by Dickens before we meet Scrooge. Fred comes to visit. So it's Christmas Eve in Scrooge's counting house, and his nephew Fred calls in. Fred is full of Christmas cheer and invites his uncle to celebrate Christmas with him the next day, an invitation that Scrooge declines. Some charity collectors then come and visit the counting house, which is where Scrooge does his business as a moneylender, and they ask for a donation to be made to support the poor at Christmas. Scrooge launches into a diatribe against the poor and refuses to make a donation, and the gentlemen walk away. We then see Scrooge being slightly unkind and cruel to Bob Cratchit, his clerk, as they prepare to leave at the end of the day, with it being Christmas Eve. Scrooge is unhappy that Bob Cratchit is afforded 1 day's paid holiday a year and demands him to be all the earlier when they return. Scrooge then goes home and sees Marley's face in his door knocker. So Jacob Marley is his long-dead business partner who passed away 7 years ago. And as he approaches his very dark house, he sees a vision of Jacob Marley's face upon the door knocker. Scrooge dismisses the image and then enters his very dark house to eat his supper. And as he does, Scrooge hears chains. As he eats his supper, Scrooge hears the disconcerting sound of chains being dragged along the floor towards his room. Ghost of Jacob Marley enters, terrifying Scrooge. Scrooge is then told that he will have 3 visitors. So Jacob Marley's ghost speaks about his chains, telling Scrooge that he has a longer one to look forward to in the afterlife. He's kept labouring on his for 7 years since Jacob Marley passed away. Scrooge is told his chance of redemption lies in the visits from 3 spirits. And then Jacob Marley's ghost drifts away into the night, joining a procession of spirits dragging chains. Scrooge then falls into a deep sleep with the stage set for him to receive his first supernatural visitor. So, to take it further, there are those key images. You're going to hear from me about quotes to know in a moment, but before we do move on, make sure you can recall all of those significant events. And if you can't, I suggest you revisit the rest of the earlier part of this video using the play bar, but you should be able to write a sentence or two for each significant moment so that you know that first chapter, Stave 1, like an expert. Okay. Quotes to know. So, Dickens describes Scrooge. Scrooge is as solitary as an oyster. He is also a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. And he's a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone. When Fred comes to visit, he says Christmas is a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time. Fred also talks about mankind being fellow passengers to the grave. And Scrooge asks Fred, why did you get married? We've got the visit of the charity collectors, and Scrooge says to them, are there no prisons? And then we have him questioning Bob, and he says, you'll want the whole day tomorrow, I suppose. When Scrooge returns home, Dickens describes where Scrooge lives and says, darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. So we associate Scrooge with darkness throughout the first stave. And then when we have Marley's visit, Scrooge says to him, you were always a good man of business. He cannot believe that Jacob Marley would be punished in the afterlife. And Jacob Marley says, mankind was my business. And then in reference to his chains, he says, I wear the chains I forged in life. And to Scrooge, he says, yours is a ponderous one. Okay, to take it further, one of the things you could do is think about the key quotes for these key moments. Can you recall them? I'd suggest making flashcards for those key references and then be able to link them to each of those key moments. Here are a range of those key moments, key quotes. This might help you to remember them and commit them to memory. So can you fill in the gaps? This is an activity that you could choose to pause here and do before moving on to the analysis, which I will provide to you now. Okay, analysis for the chapter. So the first thing we've got is some contrasting characters. So Scrooge is a contrasting character to Fred, his nephew, who embodies the spirit of Christmas. Dickens uses enumeration, which is listing, to emphasise the opposition and contrast between the two of them. So Scrooge is a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. And Fred says Christmas is a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time. So those patterns of language there that you can see used by Dickens provide a direct contrast between the two characters. He's also a contrasting character to the ghost of Christmas present that we meet in Stave 3. So Dickens uses juxtaposing descriptions to characterise the ghost of Christmas present. Scrooge has red eyes and this ghost has a sparkling eye. Scrooge is a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, and the ghost of Christmas present has an open hand. So the descriptions used are in direct contrast with each other to provide that juxtaposition. We've also got some symbolism in Stave 1. We've got the chains. So the chains that Jacob Marley's ghost wear are a symbol for consequence. If Scrooge doesn't find redemption through anagnorisis, which is realisation and change, a moment where a character comes to realise the error of their ways, then he will suffer wearing them in the afterlife. So we've got a couple of references to those in the novella. The idea of Scrooge being a scraping character alludes to this, and it's also significant that the ghost of Christmas present is unconstrained and free, which is an indirect reference to the chains in that description of that ghost. We can also think about the context of the novella. Charles Dickens was somebody who suffered at the hands of a creditor, likely to have been similar to Scrooge. His parents were unable to repay their creditors and were sent to Marshalsea debtors' prison, with young Charles sent to a blacking factory at the age of 12 when his time at school came to an end. Scrooge, who says, "Are there no prisons?" to the charity collectors, is the embodiment of the creditors he may have envisioned his parents owing money to. A reference to his parents' situation, a couple awaiting the ruin of their family, is included in Stave 4. We've also got the binary opposition of darkness versus light. Scrooge faces suffering in the afterlife unless he finds redemption, and this idea in the narrative is symbolised in the opposition of darkness and light. The symbolism of darkness and light reoccurs throughout the novella, used by Dickens to emphasise the messages about generosity and happiness that the spirits have for Scrooge. And one other thing you could mention is Scrooge's use of interrogatives. In the first chapter, he asks a lot of questions of others. He says, "Why did you get married to Fred?" He says, "You want the whole day tomorrow, I suppose," to Bob Cratchit. And he says, "Are there no prisons?" to the charity collectors. But when Jacob Marley's ghost arrives, he says to Scrooge, "Yours is a ponderous one." So the thing that Scrooge should be questioning is the impact he has on others and the consequences of the way he is living his life. Okay, check out the other videos on my channel. I'll continue to add content. Feel free to ask for something you'd like to see me cover in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share, and keep revising.